The radio crackles at 11:52 p.m., and I already know before dispatch finishes the sentence that we don't have enough aircraft for what's coming. Corbin, we've got a heart out of Fairview Regional, viable window closes at 2:40, and a kidney out of St. Aldrich closing at 3:15, both flagged priority 1, the dispatcher says, and behind her voice I can hear the wind picking up outside, rattling something loose against the building. I pull up corridor on the main screen, the routing and allocation system that's run our fleet assignments for going on 2 years now, and it's already generated flight plans for both, Helicopter 4 to Fairview, Helicopter 4 to St. Aldrich, same tail number, 2 different jobs, both showing green, both showing comfortable margin. That's the same aircraft, I say, mostly to myself, corridors putting the same bird on both runs. System says it can make both, the dispatcher says, sequential, it's got buffer built in. I already know what's wrong before I check the weather feed, because I've seen this exact shape of problem before, just never this close to the edge. I pull the regional radar and there it is, a fast-moving band of freezing rain rolling in from the northwest, exactly the kind of system that grounds rotor aircraft for hours at a time. And Corridor's flight plan for Helicopter 4 doesn't have a single line in it accounting for the fact that 2 of our other 3 aircraft are already sitting grounded at their pads because of ice building on the blades. I walk the length of the dispatch floor once, just to clear my head, past the bank of monitors showing every active job in the region, past the window where I can see the first fine needles of freezing rain starting to catch the security light outside, and by the time I get back to my station I've already decided I'm not letting Corridor make this call alone tonight. 2 years earlier, in a conference room 3 floors up from where I'm standing now, my regional operations director, a man named Roland Ferris, had stood at the head of a table and told the whole logistics team that the old triage board, the physical whiteboard with magnets we used to move by hand for every single transport, was going to be retired. "We're not doing this on gut instinct anymore," he'd said, tapping the projector screen showing Corridor's dashboard for the first time. "The system optimizes across the whole fleet in real time, it's faster than any of us, and it doesn't get tired at 3 in the morning." I remember agreeing with him. Mostly, I'd spent 11 years moving magnets across that whiteboard by hand, 11 years of gut check calls made on 4 hours of sleep, and the idea of something smarter watching the whole board at once genuinely appealed to me. I wasn't the one dragging my feet in that meeting. Roland had come up through the operations side, not logistics, spent a decade in hospital administration before Meridian Regional Transport brought him in specifically to modernize the dispatch system, and he wasn't a stranger to the mission the way some outside hires are. His own father had spent 6 years on a heart transplant list before finally getting the call, so when he talked about shaving minutes off delivery windows, it never read as pure efficiency talk to me, it read as personal. Which made it easier to trust him early on than maybe I should have. The rollout took 8 months from that first meeting to full deployment, and for most of those 8 months I was one of Corridor's loudest supporters on the floor, dragging skeptical dispatchers over to my monitor to show them how it could reroute a ground ambulance around an accident on the interstate faster than any of us could have caught it manually, and I believed every word of what I was telling them. Back in the dispatch center, the wind is louder now, and I'm on the phone with the pilot for Helicopter 4, a woman named Denise who's flown for us almost as long as I've worked here, and she's telling me flatly that she's not comfortable making a second run once the freezing rain band moves through, not without at least 90 minutes on the ground first to de-ice properly. Corridor's plan doesn't have that 90 minutes in it, I tell her. It's got you wheels up for St. Aldrich 11 minutes after you land back here from Fairview. Then Corridor's plan is wrong, she says, and hangs up to focus on the approach. I check the other 2 aircraft in our fleet while I've still got a second, Helicopter 2 grounded at its pad since 10 o'clock with visible ice already forming on the rotor housing. According to the maintenance log nobody had flagged as unavailable in the system yet, and Helicopter 3 down for a scheduled service that was supposed to finish an hour ago but is running late because a part shipment got delayed. Neither one showing as unavailable in Corridor's live allocation view, both still counted somewhere in the model's sense of what resources exist tonight even though neither one is going anywhere. I radio the maintenance shed directly, get a technician named Ojo on the line, and ask him point blank how long until Helicopter 2 is de-iced enough to fly if we need it as a backup, and he tells me 40 minutes at the earliest, maybe 50 depending on how hard the freezing rain keeps coming down, and I write that number on a sticky note and press it to the edge of my monitor. Because for the next few hours it matters more than almost anything on the screen in front of me. That's the piece that finally makes the whole shape of the problem click into place for me standing there. Corridor isn't wrong about the fleet roster, 3 helicopters exist, that part's true, it's wrong about which of those 3 are actually reachable for a given job in a given window, and nobody ever built the system a reliable, real-time feed of grounded status. Somebody assumed maintenance holds and weather holds would get manually flagged fast enough to matter, and most nights that assumption holds up. Fine, right up until the one night it doesn't. 6 months before that night, we'd had a near miss, smaller, quieter, nobody outside the dispatch floor ever heard about it. Corridor had assigned the same ground ambulance to 2 overlapping transports across town during a bad traffic window, and the only reason it didn't turn into a real problem was that one of our senior dispatchers, a guy named Phil, caught the overlap by hand, the old-fashioned way, glancing at both jobs on his second monitor and doing the math himself before either vehicle left the lot. Phil had been skeptical of Corridor from the first meeting, one of the dispatchers I'd had to talk into trusting it during the rollout, and there was a particular quiet satisfaction in his voice when he brought me the printout that day, not gloating exactly, just the flat certainty of a man who'd said something might happen and then watched it happen. I brought it to Roland the next week, sat across from him with the incident notes printed out, and he read through it carefully. I'll give him that, he wasn't dismissive in the way people sometimes are when you tell them their pet project has a flaw. The model's confidence scoring is per transport, he said, turning the printout over in his hands. Each job gets evaluated on its own merits, travel time, weather, viability window, and it comes back green if that one job looks achievable. Right, I said, but it doesn't know Denise is already committed somewhere else for the next 90 minutes when it says yes to a second job. It should be accounting for vehicle availability as a hard constraint, he said, that's basic fleet logic. It's accounting for whether the vehicle exists, I said, not whether the vehicle is free. There's a difference, and I don't think the model actually sees that difference. He told me he'd have the engineering team look into it, and I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't sitting on some prophetic certainty that this was going to blow up. I raised a concern. He took it seriously enough to say he'd act on it, and then the weeks turned into months the way they do, and other things got prioritized. Budget season hit. A different system migration ate up engineering's attention for most of the fall, and I let it go further than I should have, because nothing had actually broken yet, and there's always something louder competing for the same handful of engineering hours. I checked in once, in October, a short email that got a short reply, still on the list, nothing urgent yet, and I remember reading that reply and feeling a small flicker of unease I didn't act on, because unease without an incident attached to it is a hard thing to escalate past a certain point. You start to sound like you're chasing a ghost. Back in the dispatch center, it's 12:14 a.m. now, and I'm standing over Phil's shoulder while he works 2 phones at once, because I've made the call to pull Corridor's recommendation entirely for the next hour and run this by hand. Fairview first, I say. Heart's got the tighter window and it's the only organ that can't survive a hold. Kidney's got more room. We can look at ground transport as a backup if the weather closes the corridor completely. Corridor's still showing green on both, Phil says, glancing at the screen. I don't care what it's showing, I say. It doesn't know 2 of our birds are iced down. Somebody never fed it live fleet status the way it needed. It's working off a fleet it thinks it has instead of the fleet we actually have tonight. Phil doesn't say I told you so, and I appreciate that more than I could say to him in the moment. He just nods once and starts dialing, and there's something almost steadying about watching him work the old way, phone against his shoulder, second monitor tracking both jobs by hand, the exact method that caught the near miss 6 months ago now carrying real weight in a way it never had to before. I call St. Aldrich myself, get the transplant coordinator on the line, a woman whose voice sounds as tired as I feel, and I tell her straight, we may need a ground contingency for the kidney, we're prioritizing the heart because of window constraints, and she doesn't argue. She's done this long enough to know what tight nights sound like. How much runway do we actually have, she asks, if it goes to ground? 2 hours, maybe 2:15 if traffic cooperates, I tell her. Your window closes at 3:15. That's thin, she says. I know, I say, I'm not going to pretend it isn't. There's a version of my own history that explains part of why this particular job has always mattered more to me than a normal dispatch role probably should. My younger sister needed a liver when I was 26, and the wait was the longest 11 weeks of my life, and when the call finally came in the middle of the night, it was a stranger driving a van through a snowstorm who made sure it got there in time. I never learned his name. I just remember my mother crying at the kitchen table when the hospital called, and some part of that stayed lodged in me permanently, which is probably why 11 years on a whiteboard never felt like drudgery to me the way it might have to somebody else. I think about that period more than I probably let on to anyone at work, the specific texture of those 11 weeks, my sister getting sicker in ways that were visible if you knew what to look for and invisible if you didn't, my parents taking turns sitting by the phone because neither of them could stand not being near it, and the strange guilt of going back to my own ordinary job in the middle of all that because somebody still had to pay rent, and I remember thinking, once the transplant actually happened, that I wanted to be on the other end of a call like that for somebody else someday, which is a naive way to end up in logistics dispatch, but it's the honest version. My sister's still around, 41 now, 2 kids, works as a school counselor 2 towns over, and she doesn't know most of the details of what happened Thursday night. I haven't told her yet, I'm not sure I will. Some of this feels like it belongs to the job and not to family dinners. Helicopter 4 lands back at base from Fairview at 1:38 a.m., the heart delivered with 18 minutes of margin, and Denise is right, the freezing rain band is directly overhead now, and she tells us flatly through the radio that she's not flying again tonight, full stop, not a negotiation. I watch her set the aircraft down through the window, ice already visible along the leading edge of the rotor blades even on that short a flight, and I think, not for the first time that night, about how much of this job comes down to people willing to say a hard true thing out loud instead of a comfortable uncertain one. Denise refusing to fly, Phil catching the ambulance overlaps 6 months back. None of that shows up anywhere in Corridor's confidence score, none of it can. That kind of refusal doesn't have a clean number attached to it. The kidney doesn't make it by air, we get it moving by ground ambulance instead, a 2-hour drive through weather that should have been a 90-minute flight, and I stay on the line with the driver for most of it, a young guy named Tomas who's only been with us 8 months, talking him through alternate routes as 2 different roads close for downed branches, watching the GPS icon crawl across the map slower than either of us wants. How's it looking back there? I ask him around the 90-minute mark, meaning the cooler, and he says it's holding steady. The transplant team walked him through the temperature checks before he left, and there's something in his voice, careful and focused, that reminds me of myself 11 years ago on a night just like this one. The transplant team at St. Aldrich manages to extend the viability window with cold storage protocols I don't fully understand, and by some margin that Phil later tells me was under 20 minutes, it works. The kidney is transplanted just before dawn. Tomas radios in from the hospital loading dock sounding like he hasn't breathed properly in 2 hours, and for a second neither of us says anything. We just sit with it. Both outcomes technically counted as successes, that's what gets written in the official incident summary, both organs delivered, both patients in surgery by sunrise, and for a while I let myself feel like maybe it hadn't been as close as it felt standing there at midnight. Then I pull the full data the next afternoon, hands still a little unsteady from no sleep, and I map out what Corridor's original plan would have actually done if we trusted it. Helicopter 4 wheels up for St. Aldrich at 12:03 a.m. as scheduled, straight into the leading edge of that freezing rain band, and there's a real chance, not a certainty, but a real chance, that we'd have had a grounded aircraft mid-transport instead of a controlled ground transport contingency decided calmly on the ground beforehand. I run the numbers 3 different ways that afternoon, the way I imagine an engineer would, because I don't fully trust my own read on it after a night with almost no sleep, and each version comes back the same. If Denise had been in the air when that band moved through instead of already back on the ground, we'd have been looking at an emergency landing decision in whether nobody wants to make that decision in, with a heart already delivered and a kidney now stranded somewhere over open country instead of moving steadily by road. I don't share those 3 versions with anyone outside the report I eventually file, because I don't want the story that circulates around the building to be, we nearly lost a helicopter. Even though some version of that is true, I want it to be about the actual mechanism that put us there, the gap between what the system believed about our fleet and what was actually sitting on the tarmac that night. I bring all of it to Roland 2 days later, the incident data, the near miss from 6 months earlier that I'd raised and let drop, the actual weather timeline against Corridor's promised windows, and I lay it out plainly. The model's confidence score has never once accounted for shared resource contention across simultaneous jobs. It treats the fleet as infinite because nobody built in a hard constraint for vehicles already committed elsewhere, and worse, it never got a reliable real-time feed of grounded status either, so on a night like Thursday it was working off a fleet it thought it had, not the fleet we actually had. I told you I'd have engineering look at this, he says, and there's an edge in his voice that wasn't there 6 months ago, defensive in a way I hadn't seen from him before. You did, I say, and I believed you, and I should have followed up harder than I did, that's on me too, but the gap's still there, Roland, and last night it wasn't a hypothetical. He's quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his hands, and when he finally speaks, it's not the confident meeting room voice from 2 years earlier. I pushed this system through fast, he says. I wanted the efficiency numbers for the board before I had a full year of edge cases to test against, and I think I convinced myself that per-job confidence was the same thing as fleet-wide safety, and it isn't, and I knew somewhere that it wasn't. I just didn't want to slow the rollout down to prove it to myself properly. It's the closest thing to an admission I ever get from him, and it doesn't feel like a movie moment. There's no handshake, no relief flooding through the room, just two tired people looking at a printout that nearly cost somebody a kidney. What happens now, I ask. Now I go back to the board with a number I don't want to give them, he says, and I tell them the rollout had a gap, and it's going to cost us to fix it properly this time instead of quickly. The fix takes 4 months to build properly, a fleet-wide contention layer added on top of Corridor's existing per-job scoring, so that before the system ever promises a delivery window, it checks whether the specific vehicle or aircraft it's assigning is actually free for that entire window, not just whether one exists somewhere in the fleet roster, and if 2 jobs draw on the same limited resource. It flags the conflict explicitly instead of quietly generating 2 green confidence scores that were never both true at once. Alongside it, maintenance and weather hold status now feeds into the system automatically from the hangar sensors instead of relying on someone remembering to flag it by hand. The engineering team that builds it brings me in for most of the design reviews, which never happened during the original rollout, and there's something almost funny about sitting in the same conference room 2 years later, on the other side of the table this time, asking the same kind of skeptical questions Phil used to ask me, and watching a young engineer named Preeti nod along and actually write my concerns down instead of filing them away as something to revisit eventually. Phil ends up on the small working group that tests the fix before it goes live, which strikes me as exactly right, the dispatcher whose instincts caught what the model couldn't, helping make sure the model finally catches it too. Roland is the one who presents the fix to the board, and he doesn't dress it up. He tells them plainly that the original rollout had a fleet capacity blind spot that nearly compounded during a weather event, and that it's fixed now, and that it should have been caught in testing before launch. I get moved into a new role after that, something we're calling model governance, half my time still on the dispatch floor, half my time auditing exactly this kind of blind spot across every automated system the region runs, and Roland signed off on creating the position, which I think is its own kind of acknowledgement even though he's never said so directly. The audit work turns out to be its own education. I spend 3 weeks going through the scheduling model our sister region uses for organ procurement teams, another 2 on the predictive model that flags which hospitals are likely to have viable donors on a given week, and I find smaller versions of the same shape of problem twice, nothing as sharp-edged as Thursday night, but the same underlying habit. A model built to look confident about one job at a time without ever being asked whether the resources behind that confidence actually exist in the moment it's needed. I bring the procurement team scheduling gap to the regional director over that program, a woman named Avelini Cho, and she takes it more easily than Roland did that first week, maybe because she's watching someone else's mistake instead of her own, or maybe because 2 years of watching Corridor's story spread through the region quietly changed what people expect to hear when someone from my new role walks into their office with a printout. Roland tells the board about his father eventually, not in the same meeting where he admits the rollout was rushed, but months later, in a smaller session about future system design principles. He mentions, almost as an aside, that his father waited 6 years for a heart before finally getting the call, And that's some part of why he pushed corridor through as fast as he did, was wanting to shave time off exactly the kind of weight his own family had lived through, and I think that context, once people had it, changed how some of the harder conversations about his judgment landed, not as an excuse, but as an explanation that made the whole thing feel less like carelessness and more like urgency that outran its own caution. We're civil now, professional, we work well together most days, but something that used to be easy between us isn't anymore. I don't take his confidence at face value the way I used to, and I don't think he expects me to. There was a period of a few weeks where our meetings were shorter than they needed to be, neither of us quite finding the old rhythm, and it's mostly come back since, mostly. There was one meeting, maybe 6 weeks after the fix went live, where Roland asked me directly whether I thought he should have stayed on as regional director at all, and I remember not answering right away, because I genuinely didn't know, and eventually I told him I thought he was better at this job now than he'd been 2 years ago, back when the whole rollout still felt like a clean when he could put his name on, and that's not nothing. But it's also not the same as telling him everything was fine. He nodded and didn't say much else, and we went back to talking about staffing for the winter schedule, and that's mostly how it's gone since, work conversations that stay work conversations, with an understanding underneath them that doesn't need to be said out loud every time. I think about that stranger who drove my sister's liver through a snowstorm more than I used to, somebody who probably never knew how close it came, who just did his job and drove through weather he didn't have to think twice about, because nobody had built a system yet that told him he had 90 extra minutes he didn't actually have. Phil retired from active dispatch shifts about 8 months after the fix went live, moved into a training role instead, and one of the first things he does with every new hire now is walk them through the near miss from before Thursday, the ambulance overlap nobody outside the floor ever heard about, not as a cautionary tale about the system, but as a lesson in trusting your own second monitor even when the first one is telling you everything's fine. The kidney patient from that night sent a card to the transplant floor a few weeks later, and someone forwarded it down to dispatch because word had gotten around about the ground transport scramble. I still have it in my desk drawer, and every so often, on a night when the weather turns and corridor's screen is glowing green across every job on the board, I open the drawer and read it again before I trust the number. Tomas asked me once, months later, over coffee in the break room, whether I thought corridor was actually good for the job overall, whether the 2 years of faster routing and fewer human errors on ordinary nights outweighed a night like Thursday, and I told him I honestly didn't know how to weigh those two things against each other on a single scale, faster on 300 ordinary nights against nearly wrong on one extraordinary one, and that maybe the honest answer is that the job was never going to let either of us stop paying attention, system or no system, and he seemed to accept that better than I expected a 23-year-old to accept an answer with no clean edge to it. Some nights the board is quiet, every job green, every window comfortable, and I still walk the floor once anyway, the way I did that night, past the monitors, past the window, just to feel the shape of what's actually out there instead of what the screen says is out there, and most nights that walk tells me nothing I didn't already know, and I do it anyway.